So let's talk a little bit about famine relief. And the usual starting point for any sort of discussion about charity or famine relief or any sort of obligation of well-off people to donate to people in very bad conditions is a paper by Peter Singer called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And his paper there, and also his arguments, centers on this example of you walking down a path and coming across a drowning child in a pond. Now, you're wearing very expensive shoes that for whatever reason will get ruined if they get wet. Let's say permanently ruined. So Singer's point with this example is that gives you no excuse not to go and wade into this pond and pull the child out. Now you can assume that this pond is 4 feet deep. There's no risk to yourself. There's no parent around. There's no one else around. For whatever reason, there's a child who has gotten loose and is now drowning. Let's say a 4-year-old drowning in this very shallow pond. And the fact that you're wearing these very nice new shoes is no excuse for you not to save the child. In fact, Peter Singer thinks it's not an instance of charity. It's not extra credit. It's not so kind of you that you wade in and pull this kid. He thinks it's obligatory, that it's your duty to save this kid, and that you're a bad person, that you have committed a moral wrong if you continue to walk by. So he is saying that this is not what we call in philosophy supererogatory. Supererogatory is a fancy word for meaning extra credit. So we normally think of things like charity, giving money to famine relief on the other side, or earthquake. Let's say there's an earthquake in Haiti, maybe a decade ago now, giving money to Haiti relief funds. That's not obligatory. You're not a bad person for not doing it because it's just moral extra credit. You can be a good person. It's really great of you to go out of your way to help these people in need who you did nothing to hurt, harm. You did nothing to put them in their condition. You went out of your way to help people that you in no way owed it to them. We think of that as supererogatory or moral extra credit, not as obligatory. That's normally what we commonsensically think about that sort of thing. And you might think the same thing about the child in the pond. I didn't push that kid in the pond. It's not my kid. I did nothing to put this kid in that situation. So it's just supererogatory for me to save that child. It's just moral extra credit. Singer thinks that this is an example that shows that that even though you did nothing to this child, the child is in a terrible situation. All it's sacrificing on your part is getting a little dirty and ruining some nice expensive shoes of yours. That is not, you're not losing anything of comparable moral importance, right? Those shoes matter to you, that you like your shoes, but they don't matter to you in the way that the life of that child matters to that child, and the life of that child matters to all these other people. So there's this huge loss to others, which only requires a minor inconvenience and minor loss to you. And so he thinks that that's enough to create an obligation for you to do something, not just extra credit, not just supererogatory, not just a chance to be charitable and go above and beyond, but actually a moral duty to help this child. Now, why is Singer giving this example? Because Singer thinks that if you take that drowning child and you move them across not just a pond, but the ocean, right? And now we have the same sort of example. You have children in, let's say there's right now, every time I give this presentation, I have to think of what's the most current example. I used to use the Haiti earthquake, sometimes Somalia, but now I think the probably principal example is Syrian refugees. You have a country that is being torn apart by warring factions, and many, many refugees fleeing to Turkey and Greece and the European Union, trying to travel across, this very treacherous ocean journey and survive in refugee camps. We could be donating to those causes and saving lives in the same way I can save the life by pulling the child out of the pond. The only difference is it's not going to ruin my shoes to save the Syrian refugees. It's that I need to just not buy the shoes. I need to either buy cheaper shoes. I'll buy just $20 shoes. I don't need to buy these fancy Yeezy whatevers. I have no idea how shoes work. I know that that's a thing, fancy shoes. Maybe you're buying the original Air Jordans, these classic Air Jordans for $1,000 on eBay because you collect shoes, and like that's like the very beginning of the sneaker craze, of a hobby of collection. Singer's point is, don't buy those. Buy just a normal pair of $40, $50 shoes that will last a long time, that are good for your back, etc. You can be concerned with that stuff, but it's the extra luxury aspect, the fashion aspect, the collector's aspect, all of that extra money you're blowing on those Air Jordans. That is money you could send to Syrian refugees and save children's lives. And that is exactly comparable to ruining the Air Jordans you've already bought when you step into the pond and pull the child out. Distance doesn't make a difference. So he thinks that we really need to be cutting out, 75, 80, 90% of the money I live on. I spend a lot of money on stupid stuff. I'm on my second pair of AirPods because I've lost my first pair because they're really easy to lose. It's $100. It's a luxury to use those instead of normal headphones. Every time I use DoorDash or Uber Eats by being lazy, that's money that I could save. If I cut back on all of these luxuries, by the end of the year, I will have several $1,000s, a lot of money to spend, which I could then donate to a good cause like this, helping Syrian refugees, to a reputable charitable organization that's not wasting the money, and because I also have to do my research, and that is comparable to coming across the child and losing that money by destroying the shoes, by wading into the pond to pull the child out of the pond and save the child. And just like that is not charity, that is not supererogatory, that's not extra credit. To pull the child out of the pond you come across and ruin your shoes, he thinks donating to Syrian refugees is also not optional. It's not supererogatory. It's not moral extra credit. It's not charity. It is obligatory. And we are bad people for not doing that. Now, when I say bad people here, Singer doesn't donate to the extent that he thinks he should. He donates quite a bit. I think like 2/3 of his income, so at least above half. So we're all striving. It's like being a better person is like quitting smoking. It's a difficult thing. You make progress, or becoming a vegetarian. You're cutting back on food, but sometimes you falter. So like when Singer says, it's obligatory, it's an obligation that's very hard to live up to because it requires such frugal living on our part. But he thinks that it is an obligation. We shouldn't think, oh, that's something I can do or need not to do, and I'm a really nice person if I do it, but I don't have to. He thinks, no, this is obligatory. It is something you morally are obligated to do, just like you are like the person who doesn't pull the child out of the pond that you walk across because you want to save your new shoes when you buy those fancy shoes in the first place, instead of saving that money and sending the excess money that you could to Syrian refugees. So that's the argument. It's an argument that charity to organizations like Syrian refugees is not moral extra credit, is not supererogatory, but in fact obligatory. So let's look at another way in which you might think about Singer's argument. One way to think about Singer's argument is this sort of premise, conclusion form. So here's one way to structure it. Premise one is lack of food and shelter and medicine is bad. Premise one seems fine. Doesn't seem like we could object to that. Premise two, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. So this is the premise which is supposed to get you to wade into the pond and ruin your shoes in order, if this child is drowning this 4-year-old's drowning in a pond, and only thing I have to sacrifice is these $500 shoes I just bought, which is not of comparable moral importance, we ought to make that sacrifice to save that child. That's the claim here. It is within our power to prevent this bad thing, depending on what we're talking about, and whether we're talking about the child in the pond or the Syrian refugees. I can find a reputable organization to send money to save people in that situation, and we can prevent it without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. There's a lot of luxuries: the AirPods, the Uber Eats, the buying a fancier car. We very easy, like when you buy a car, you can buy just one that gets you to work and then has good gas mileage. You don't have to buy a Mustang. I don't know my cars. GTO, that's a thing, right? V8, right? That's thousands and thousands of dollars more going into the car than necessary, and that is not of comparable moral importance to the lives of these Syrian children, Syrian refugees. Sub-conclusion, therefore, we ought to prevent the lack of food and shelter and medicine. The only way to prevent lack of food and shelter without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance is to give maximally, so cutting out Uber Eats, cutting out the AirPods, cutting out of the fancier car, cutting out the very nice speaker that I have on my, you can't see this, but I have a $200 keyboard. It's a IBM Model M SSK from 1987, which I have to clean. It's like a hobby to keep this thing running. That is something that I should sell and then buy a $10 keyboard and send the extra $190 to Syrian refugees. That's something I can do. So I need to cut back on every sort of luxury. This is Singer's argument. Conclusion, we ought to give maximally, cut out all of these luxuries in our lives and donate to things like Syrian refugees. Other things you could donate to, netting for mosquitoes. Thousands and thousands of people die in many countries because of lack of mosquito netting, because mosquitoes carry malaria, so they die of malaria. I don't know if you've ever been into a country where there's a lot of mosquitoes and you don't have mosquito netting, but it sucks. And so that's a huge lifesaver, and it's relatively cheap, and that's an easy thing to donate towards. And if you're worried that donating food, Singer himself is not a big fan of food aid because it does create dependencies, except for in cases like earthquakes or like sudden emergencies, which are temporary. Then giving food aid's fine, but sort of long-term food aid undermines the local food economy coming into existence, and so there's a problem with food aid, that long-term food aid. But there's other things you can donate to, like the mosquito netting. The Syrian refugee crisis is something that seems like a temporary problem, but you're also donating to countries which are just trying to provide the refugees a place to live, like Greece or Turkey. Right. So let's think about what I want you to think about is which of these premises you would object to if you tried to undermine Singer's argument. I presume that the thing that we need to object to is premise 2, right? If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without so you want to say, no, this sort of charity really is supererogatory. Even pulling the child from the pond is supererogatory. I didn't push the kid in. It's not my kid. I have no responsibility to the kid, so I don't need to say. I'm not a bad person. It's not obligatory for me not to wade into the pool and ruin my $500 shoes to save the kid. That's a very hard position, I think, to convince people of. But I think that the way you need to argue against Singer is to say, I buy you could try to break the analogy and say the kid in the pond is different from the Syrian refugee. I don't have any hope in thinking that that's going to succeed, although you might try pushing that line. I think that they are comparable. I think he's right. The move, one thing to say, and one thing you can say is, well, Singer's just right. I'm a bad person. I should try to be better. Maybe that's what I think is true. But if I were to try disagreeing with Singer, I think I would reject the idea that it's obligatory to pull the infant out of the pond unless I have in some way incurred a debt or an obligation to pull the kid out, and any sort of help to another, which is not somebody I've made a promise to, somebody I've harmed by pushing them into the pool, somebody I've taken on the responsibility for caring for by, giving birth to them, or putting them in that situation, or by being hired as the lifeguard. That anything I do to somebody I have no obligation to or incurred an obligation to is just moral extra credit and supererogatory. So even in the pond case, that's one way, and that would be rejecting premise 2 of this argument. Here's a couple objections you might raise that people have raised. I think that it's only the second. The one I'm raising is the second one. But objection 1: Singer's analysis conflicts with our prevailing standards of charity. We think of charity as supererogatory, beyond duty, beyond what is obligatory moral extra credit. The response to that is like, what the fuck does morality have to do with our common sense? Like, there's lots of things we're talking about in this class that go against what our common sense moral standards are. I mean, there's no reason to think our common sense moral standards would be correct. Once we think about things, we can discover that, our common sense moral standards make no sense and require revision. And there's, of course, no point in thinking about anything in a university classroom physics if you can just, by common sense, know how the world works. So I don't have very much sympathy for objection 1. Objection 2 is the one that I think I would maybe want to push, is Singer's analysis requires, I think it says Singer's analysis requires us to do a great deal for others. This is sometimes called like the over-demandingness objection, that it's requiring too much of people. I push the idea that positive obligations to help others don't just exist, you have to incur them by taking on the responsibility, or being, by pushing the kid in the pond, or taking on the responsibility for the kid. And if you don't take on the responsibility, then it's supererogatory, extra credit for you to help them. Another way to go is to say something like, this sort of moral system that Singer is offering is just way too demanding and makes morality, it undermines our lives, right? Because I have to give up, I can't have this hobby of cleaning this old 1987 or 1984? 1987 keyboard. It's kind of dirty right now. And it undermines the sort of values that you build your life. You can't buy flowers for your loved ones. Instead, you should save that money and donate it to charity. You can't have a hobby of buying and collecting fancy shoes or keyboards or whatever. And so it's a way in which you might say there's a problem with morality undermining our private lives and the sort of values and projects that we build our personal lives around, that might undermine, the way that Bernard Williams puts this objection is that it undermines the sort of projects that give our lives value, that get us up in the morning and make us want to live, right? I want to go do things for my loved ones, spend time with my loved ones, engage in my hobbies, like the things that matter to me. And if the moral system requires me to give all of that up, I'm not going to even be motivated to do morality. I'm just going to stay in bed. You need to leave people a bubble of room to live their lives, sort of selfishly and directed towards the things that matter to them, in order to let them, continue to be motivated to live. That's one way to go for objection 2, is this sort of over-demanding this objection. 3, direct relief just is a short-term solution. It simply delays additional problems. You might be inclined to, this just means if you donate to the wrong organizations, they can screw it up and not make things better. That might be true. There are organizations that are good. There's an organization called GiveWell. So if you go to givewell.com, they do empirical research about what charities actually make an impact, and make sure that there's no sort of negative side effects of what the organization's doing. So, of course, there's lots of charities that screw up and do bad jobs and create dependencies or don't actually solve the problem. But there's plenty of organizations that do. One thing that Singer points out, I think that world poverty has been cut in half, even though since the 1950s, even though the Earth's population has doubled. So the idea that poverty, you never eliminate problems eternally, right? But we've made an enormous amount of progress on a lot of things. So charity is not hopeless. It's just that you need to make sure you do a good job and donate to the right sorts of organizations. One objection is that Singer's ideas will hurt the economy. Of course, if everybody started cutting back, you might ruin the economy and make things worse. But that's not going to happen, right? Singer's trying to persuade us to one by one switch into donating more to charity, and that's going to be a slow process that is only partially carried out by all of us, in the same way that you have to, he tries to convince people to be vegetarian, in the same way that there's lots of things where there might be a worry about carrying it out all at once, but that's really not in the cards, right? That's not something that's going to happen. It's more of trying to convince people to donate more, to save more lives, and to reduce the sort of number of people in suffering, like at these Syrian refugee camps in southern Europe and Jordan. I'm thinking of all the countries the Syrian refugees are fleeing to. Okay, There's one other objection I wanted to put here, but I didn't. Well, I forget it, but maybe you'll think of more. There's more you can raise and I hope that you'll talk about it in the forum.